Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be unpacking some seriously thought-provoking stuff today. We're going way back to 1928
Oh, wow.
to explore a book called Propaganda. It was written by a guy named Edward Bernays, who is considered by many to be the father of public relations.
Interesting.
And get this, his ideas were so revolutionary back then
Yeah.
that they're still shaping how we communicate and persuade, even today. So we're talking about the subtle forces that influence everything from what you buy to what you believe.
I like it.
Pretty deep stuff.
Yeah, what's fascinating about Bernays is that he saw propaganda everywhere, and he didn't necessarily think it was a bad thing.
Really?
Yeah, his book opens with a definition that might raise a few eyebrows.
Okay.
He says, and I'm quoting here, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society."
Whoa.
Now, that might sound a little sinister, but remember, this was 1928. The word propaganda didn't have the same negative baggage it does today.
Yeah, I can see how that quote might make you squirm a little in your seat. I mean, manipulation isn't exactly a word that inspires those warm and fuzzy feelings, right?
Right. But Bernays saw propaganda as a neutral tool, like a force that could be used for good or bad. He believed that understanding how it works is crucial because it's so powerful. Whether we like it or not, propaganda shapes our world.
Okay, so let's dig into some of Bernays' key ideas. One of the things that jumped out at me was this concept of an invisible government. He talks about how a select few are pulling the strings, shaping the opinions and desires of the masses. It kind of sounds like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
But he insists it's just a natural consequence of how complex our modern world is.
He's not talking about some secret society or anything like that. Bernays argued that this invisible government emerges because we rely on experts and opinion leaders to help us make sense of the overwhelming amount of information we face every day.
That's a good point.
Think about it. You turn to certain sources for news, for advice, even for figuring out which movies to watch. You're essentially delegating the task of filtering information and forming opinions to people you perceive as knowledgeable. According to Bernays, that's where a lot of influence lies.
That's so true. I mean, I definitely have my go-to websites, podcasts, and even friends whose opinions I value more than others. I
Right.
never really thought of it as delegating my decision-making, but I guess it is, in a way. And you're telling me Bernays was onto this almost 100 years ago.
Absolutely. He was brilliant at recognizing how influence flows within society. He saw that we're not just a mass of individuals, but rather a collection of groups and associations, each with its own set of beliefs and leaders.
He actually lists out a crazy number of these groups in his book. I mean, he gets super specific,
Yeah.
mentioning everything from obvious ones like political parties to some really obscure ones like the National Pickle Packers Association.
Oh, wow.
I couldn't help but chuckle when I read that.
Right. It sounds funny, but it illustrates his point perfectly. Society isn't this uniform block, but rather a complex web of interconnected groups. And Bernays argued that if you could target the right group with the right message, especially a group with influential leaders, that message could spread like wildfire through the rest of society, almost like a chain reaction.
So it's like a domino effect. Target the right domino and the rest will fall into place.
Yeah.
Did he have any real-world examples of this in action?
Oh, absolutely. One that really stands out is the story of how the velvet industry, which was on the verge of collapse because velvet had gone out of fashion, managed to stage a dramatic comeback.
Wow.
They didn't do it by randomly trying to convince everyone to wear velvet again. They got strategic.
Okay, so spill the tea. How did they do it?
They knew that to bring velvet back, they needed to start at the source of fashion, Paris.
Ooh la la.
They set up a velvet fashion service and worked behind the scenes with Parisian designers and fashion houses to incorporate velvet into their collections.
So they were planting the seeds of the trend, right where it mattered most. Clever.
Exactly. They even went a step further and got influential figures like countesses and duchesses to wear velvet creations to high-profile events.
Oh, wow.
They were creating an aura of desirability around velvet.
So they weren't just designing clothes, they were designing perceptions.
Yes. And guess what?
Right.
It worked. American fashion buyers, seeing velvet showcased by those Parisian designers, started placing orders. Magazines and newspapers picked up on the trend. And pretty soon, everyone wanted velvet.
So velvet was back in.
Bernays saw this as a prime example of how strategically manufactured circumstances could influence public perception.
So he's saying that you don't just promote a product, you create a whole narrative around it. You make people want it by associating it with things they already desire. like exclusivity, beauty, or being in the in crowd.
That's a great way to put it. And this wasn't just about fashion. He gives examples from all sorts of fields. Real estate, public health, where these principles of propaganda are being used to shape public opinion and behavior.
It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? It makes you wonder how much of what we think and want is actually influenced by forces we're not even aware of. But hold on. We've been using this word propaganda a lot. Bernays himself actually pushed for a different term. He preferred to call it public relations.
Right. Bernays recognized that the word propaganda was becoming increasingly loaded with negative connotations, even back then. He saw the need for a more neutral term. To describe the work he was doing, he championed the rise of public relations counsel, professionals who could act as a bridge between powerful entities and the public.
So like a translator of sorts, helping each side understand the other.
Exactly. He described the role as someone who could interpret enterprises and ideas to the public, and just as importantly, interpret the public back to those in power. It's a delicate balancing act, for sure.
And it raises some serious ethical questions, doesn't it? I mean, where does persuasion end and manipulation begin?
That's a question we'll definitely be exploring further as we delve deeper into Bernays' work.
Wow.
But for now, let's uncover even more fascinating insights from propaganda.
Expert, welcome back. I don't know about you, but after that last segment, I'm starting to see propaganda everywhere.
Right. Once you start noticing it, you can't unsee it.
It's kind of freaky.
Yeah.
But also fascinating.
Bernays gives all these real-world examples that really bring his ideas to life. Like, remember how we were talking about the power of targeting influential groups? He uses fashion trends as a prime example.
Yeah, he was way ahead of his time with that one. This was decades before Instagram influencers and all that.
Exactly. Back in the 1920s, Bernays observed how fashion leaders, often in Paris, would adopt certain styles, and then those styles would trickle down to the masses. He even describes how a silk manufacturer convinced a shoe company to start making silk shoes specifically to match women's dresses. They created a whole new trend just like that.
That's wild. It's like they were playing puppet master with the entire fashion industry.
Well, Bernays was really into the psychology behind all of this. He was fascinated by the work of Sigmund Freud and other psychologists who were exploring the unconscious mind. He believed that people's decisions, especially their buying decisions, are often driven by emotions, social pressures, and even deeply ingrained desires that they're not even aware of.
So you're saying we're not as rational as we think we are. Our choices are being secretly influenced by all these unseen forces.
In a way, yes. Bernays argued that to really understand how propaganda works, you need to understand the human psyche.
Okay.
One of the examples he uses is this real estate development called Jackson Heights.
Jackson Heights.
It's a whole case study in how to make something seem incredibly desirable, even if it wasn't initially.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did they do?
The developers of Jackson Heights used all these clever tactics to create an aura of prestige and desirability around the place. They staged these lavish events, like a benefit performance featuring famous actors and socialites. To associate the development with wealth and exclusivity, they even held a competition for interior designers to create the most beautiful apartments, further elevating the perception of Jackson Heights as a stylish and sophisticated place to live.
So they were carefully crafting an image, the story that people wanted to be a part of.
Exactly. And get this, they purposely built the tallest building in the development, just a few feet taller than the tallest skyscraper in the world at that time, just to make a statement.
That's hilarious. They were totally flexing. It's like they were saying, look at us, we're the best, the most innovative, the most desirable.
It's a perfect example of what Bernays called dramatization.
Dramatization.
He understood the power of spectacle, of creating a buzz, of grabbing people's attention with these grand gestures.
So he's saying that sometimes facts and logic aren't enough to persuade people. You have to appeal to their emotions, their sense of aspiration.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bernays wasn't just talking about selling products or real estate. He believed that even seemingly altruistic efforts, like public health campaigns, rely on these same principles of persuasion.
Really? So even when people are trying to do good, they're using propaganda?
Well, remember, Bernays saw propaganda as a neutral tool. He believed it could be used ethically to achieve positive outcomes. He gives examples of public health campaigns that used emotional appeals, celebrity endorsements, and carefully crafted messages to encourage people to adopt healthier habits.
I guess that makes sense. If you want people to change their behavior, you can't just lecture them. You have to make them want to change.
Right. He also points out that new technologies, like the radio or the automobile, were initially met with a lot of resistance.
Really?
It took a concerted effort
Hmm.
to convince the public of their benefits.
So even progress requires a bit of propaganda.
In a way, yes. Bernays saw propaganda as a tool for overcoming inertia, for breaking down resistance to change, and for ultimately promoting progress. It's all about framing the message in a way that resonates with people's needs, desires, and values.
And like you're telling a story that people want to buy into, right?
Exactly. And Bernays was a master storyteller. He understood the psychology of persuasion and how to use it effectively. And speaking of stories, he has a whole chapter in his book dedicated to the relationship between business and the public.
Oh yeah, let's talk about that. What did Bernays have to say about how businesses should operate in this world of propaganda?
Well, he argued that in the modern era, businesses can't afford to ignore public opinion. They need to cultivate goodwill, build trust, and establish a positive reputation if they want to succeed.
That seems obvious now,
Yeah.
but I thought it was a pretty radical idea back then.
It was. Bernays understood that with the rise of mass production, businesses needed to find new ways to connect with consumers, to create demand for their products, and to build lasting relationships with their customers. Traditional advertising wasn't enough anymore.
Right. If you can churn out 1 million widgets in a factory, you need the 1 million people to buy them.
Yeah.
You can't just put up a billboard and call it a day.
Exactly. Bernays argued that businesses needed to engage in a more holistic form of communication, one that took into account every interaction they had with the public, everything from their labor practices to their philanthropic activities, to the way their products were designed, and even the look of their stores. It all contributed to the overall image they projected.
So he's saying that every touch point matters. It's all part of the story you're telling about your brand.
You got it. He gives this great example of a bakery that not only advertised its bread, but also made sure its delivery wagons were spotlessly clean and visually appealing.
That's right.
It was all about projecting this image of quality, trustworthiness, and attention to detail.
That's brilliant. It's like they were saying, we care about every aspect of our business, even the delivery wagons, because we care about you, the customer.
Exactly. And Bernays also talked about the rise of what he called the new competition.
The new competition.
It's not just about competing with other businesses in the same industry. It's about competing with every other business for a share of the consumer's wallet.
That's so true. I mean, think about it. These days, you're not just deciding between Coke and Pepsi. You're deciding between buying a soda, going to the movies, getting takeout, or a million other things.
Right. So businesses need to be a lot more strategic about how they position themselves in the public mind. They need to create a compelling narrative that makes them stand out from the crowd and connects with consumers on an emotional level.
So it's not just about selling a product. It's about selling an experience, a feeling, an idea.
You got it. And Bernays was a master at recognizing this and developing a strategic approach to public relations that encompassed every aspect of a business's interactions with the public.
This is seriously making me rethink how I see the world. It's like Bernays is pulling back the curtain and showing us how the puppet strings are being pulled. But before we go too deep down that rabbit hole, let's talk about something that Bernays emphasized throughout his book, the issue of ethics.
You're right to bring that up. Bernays was acutely aware of the potential for propaganda to be misused, to manipulate people for nefarious purposes. He repeatedly stressed the importance of ethical considerations in the practice of public relations.
But how do you draw the line between ethical persuasion and straight-up manipulation? That seems like a slippery slope.
It is, and that's a question we'll be diving into even further in the next part of our deep dive, where we explore how Bernays believed these principles applied to the world of politics.
All right, we're back and ready to tackle the big one, politics.
Ooh.
I have a feeling this is where Bernays' ideas get really controversial.
You're not wrong. Bernays believed that in a modern democracy, political leadership isn't just about holding power, it's about shaping public opinion. He even went so far as to say that the successful politician of the future needs to be a skilled propagandist.
Whoa, hold on. Did you really say that? That's kind of a scary thought, isn't it? Are you telling me our elected officials are using these mind control tactics on us?
Well, let's not get too dramatic. Bernays believed that politicians, just like businesses, need to understand the psychology of the masses. They need to know how to persuade people, how to craft a compelling narrative, how to connect with voters on an emotional level.
So it's not enough to just have good policies anymore. You have to be a master manipulator, too.
Again, Bernays wouldn't have used the word manipulator. He believed that effective communication was essential for any leader, especially in a democracy. He argued that the old-fashioned approach to political campaigning, just stating your positions and hoping people agree, was no longer effective.
Yeah, I can see how that might not cut it in today's world. People are bombarded with information from all sides. You have to really grab their attention if you want to get your message across.
Exactly. Bernays argued that politicians need to be more strategic, more creative in how they communicate with the public. He even compares a political campaign to a sales campaign.
Interesting.
He asks, what would a company executive say to a sales manager who spent a fortune sending a high-priced speaker to describe their product to a tiny audience?
Ouch, that's got to sting. He's basically saying that politicians need to stop boring people with long-winded speeches and start using more engaging methods to get their message across.
You got it. Bernays believed that politicians should embrace the latest techniques of persuasion. He even gave a fascinating example of how a politician campaigning on a low-tariff platform could use these techniques effectively.
Okay, I'm all ears. How would they do that?
Instead of just telling people that high tariffs increase the cost of goods, he suggests staging a series of low-tariff exhibitions in cities across the country. These exhibitions would dramatically illustrate the price differences between goods under a high-tariff regime and a low-tariff regime.
So it's about showing, not just telling.
Exactly. He even suggests having prominent figures boycott certain goods until tariffs are lowered, creating a media spectacle that would capture public attention.
It's all about making the issue feel real, relatable, something that directly impacts people's lives.
Right. Bernays understood that people are more likely to be persuaded by what they see and feel than by abstract arguments.
That's a good point.
But he didn't stop there. He also emphasized the importance of understanding how different groups within society influence the masses.
So it's back to that idea of the invisible government again.
Exactly. Bernays believed that to effectively shape public opinion, you need to identify the key groups that influence the masses and tailor your message accordingly. Instead of trying to reach everyone at once, you target the influencers.
So you're saying politicians should be focusing on building relationships with leaders of these influential groups, figuring out their concerns, and then framing their policies in a way that appeals to those groups.
You're catching on. It's about understanding the levers of power and influence within society and using those levers strategically. Of course, this all sounds a little Machiavellian, but remember, Bernays believed that these techniques could be used for good or bad.
I mean, it's definitely a bit unsettling to think about. These techniques being used in politics, how do we know that they're being used ethically?
That's a valid concern. Bernays argued that truly ethical politicians would use their understanding of persuasion to promote policies that genuinely serve the public interest. He even suggested that the U.S. government should create a Secretary of Public Relations as a member of the president's cabinet.
Wow, Secretary of Public Relations. That's kind of wild. What would they do?
Bernays envisioned this role as someone who would act as a bridge between the government and the people, ensuring that the government's actions were understood and supported by the public. It's like he's saying that in a modern democracy, transparency and effective communication are essential.
That actually makes a lot of sense. If the government wants people to trust them, they need to be open and honest about what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Absolutely. Bernays believed that the government had a responsibility to keep the public informed, to explain their policies clearly, and to build trust with the citizens.
So what's the big takeaway here? Is Bernays advocating for a world where we're all constantly being manipulated by slick politicians and PR gurus?
Not necessarily. Bernays believed that persuasion, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, was an inevitable part of modern life. He argued that instead of trying to eliminate it, we needed to understand it, to become more aware of how it works.
So it's about developing our critical thinking skills, learning to see through the spin and the manipulation.
Exactly. Bernays believed that by understanding the techniques of persuasion, we could become more discerning consumers of information, more critical thinkers, more active participants in shaping our own destinies.
That's a powerful message, and one that's even more relevant today than it was back in Bernays' time. We're bombarded with information from all sides. It's easy to get swept up in the hype, the fear, the outrage. We need to be careful, thoughtful consumers of information.
I couldn't agree more. Bernays' work challenges us to be aware of the forces that are constantly trying to influence our thoughts and actions. It's a challenge worth accepting.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into Edward Bernays' propaganda. We hope this has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to be a little more skeptical, a little more critical of the messages you encounter every day. Thanks for joining us.